Hey, hi, it's David Blackmon here again with our weekly legislative update for the Texas session of the legislature with the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, Jason Modglin. Jason, how you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. I bet you're a little tired at the end of this week with all the activity around the inaugural. Did you go to the any of the inauguration events?
We were only able to make the party at the Austin City Limits on Tuesday night, and so my wife and I went out and had a good time, but got close to 10:30, and we were going to turn into pumpkins, so we had to go home. But great time out there. Definitely a smaller event than in years past. Usually this has been kind of just a blowout at the Austin Convention Center.
Yeah.
I've been in the past and nearly 10,000 people invited, sometimes in the middle of snowstorms. This year was considerably smaller venue. So only about 2,600 folks in attendance, and they had some good musical acts, but didn't even make it inside. It was crowded and stayed on kind of the foyer area.
Well, I'm glad to hear they were able to just do that stuff. The last couple of years, they might not have been able to do any kind of event like that due to COVID. So at least
That's
we're
right.
past all that. I used to avoid all that stuff like the plague, man. Dan Hinkle or Chris Hosick would always have tickets for me to get into these things, and I just, always would just decline and let's get on with the session.
That's right.
So anyway, we had some interesting events, though, in the legislature. For one thing, both houses introduced initial budget proposals that, gosh, I mean, they're big, $130 billion in general revenue spending, and then all this other money coming in from Washington and things like that. But leaving an awful lot of money left on the table. The Texas Tribune has a headline that says they're leaving $50 billion still unspent in these budget proposals.
Yeah, quite a bit of discretionary room there for both chambers to really build out their budget. I think what's remarkable, and really you've seen this in the last couple sessions, is that both the House and Senate start at very similar starting places. When I was a young staffer and helping on those budgets, very frequently the House and Senate were quite at odds from starting point and priorities. But really, you have both the House and Senate remarkably in sync with each other, and that's quite a bit of work on members' part and also their staffs really throughout the fall. And they kind of culminate that budget at the end of October, sometimes into November. So it's great that they're from a similar starting point. Some big ticket items in there. Nearly $15 billion set aside for property tax relief. Kind of an interesting approach. You have both an increase in the homestead exemption, but also an increase in the business personal property tax exemption, which the lieutenant governor rightly called this a nuisance tax. The threshold is ridiculously low.
Yeah.
We have to pay it here at the Alliance for a couple of desks and chairs. Pay out our business personal property tax every year, and so really looking forward to that hopefully going away. And that'll result in some nice savings, particularly for small businesses that don't have, a couple computers, a couple filing cabinets, and all of a sudden now we owe some property taxes.
Well, and for those who aren't familiar with how it works, the homestead exemption is just a portion of the value of your home that the local taxing districts aren't able to apply property taxes on, and it has been $40,000 exemption, and it's only for your primary homestead. It doesn't apply to any rental properties you might own. And they're talking about raising that to $70,000 now, which is a pretty hefty. I mean, it's almost a doubling of the homestead exemption, so that's pretty significant.
Nearly a doubling, but also prior to 2021 legislative session, actually a special session, the number was 25,000. So
Yeah.
you're talking about nearly a tripling in the span of 3 years, and so that's really providing a lot of property tax relief to the majority of Texans. Now, median value here in Austin is considerably higher than 70,000. But for most of the state, you're gonna take out a good chunk of
Yeah.
the value of that home, and that's providing some fantastic property tax relief, particularly to rural areas of the state, and lower income Texans.
Yeah, I mean, and so the beauty of that, and when you talk about it in those terms, is that it really, as a percentage of the value of your home, it provides a bigger break to homes with lesser value, right? And so it's really kind of a progressive style of tax cut here in a
That's right.
state that doesn't have an income tax and only has what we typically think about as being regressive taxing mechanisms. This is a pretty progressive tax cut that really benefits folks with lower means than the rest, than people with, in the upper class. So, it's a pretty commendable move.
To that exact point, the Texas Taxpayers and Research Association put out a report this week. Their focus is largely on businesses, and so they talked about kind of the myth of the low tax state being Texas, and but they broke it down by individuals and by businesses. And for individuals, Texas is hard to beat. It's one of the lowest tax states in the union. Easily in the top 5 every year. But then you go the exact opposite for businesses, and we have unfortunately very high business taxes in the state, particularly if you have a lot of capital investment. And so our property tax is very punitive to those types of businesses.
And that's one of the reasons why taxing districts are have made such a common practice over the last 30, 40 years of offering property tax breaks to major business projects that want to come into the state, because the punitive nature of business taxation in Texas really, if they didn't do that, we would not have nearly the business environment we have in Texas that we enjoy here now.
That's right.
So, as part of the inauguration, of course, the governor and the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, made their inaugural addresses. And I took, of course, I'm always focused on energy, and in those speeches, it was about the electric grid. And they both talked about, saying they were going to do stuff. The lieutenant governor said it's the most important thing we can do in this year's session. And the governor said, we all know that increased demand is going to be placed on the grid as Texas continues to grow. So this session, we will build a grid that powers our state, not for the next 4 years, but for the next 40 years. That's a pretty big chore, isn't it?
It is a very big chore. First, yes, there was a focus on the grid. I was disappointed that there wasn't more talk about oil and gas, because really under both of their leadership, Texas has phenomenally grown our production. Really bailed out Europe this past winter. We're still in the midst of winter there, and you only get this speech every 4 years. I mean, really could have hammered on the good things that both administrations have worked on for oil and gas to provide energy security for the world. But that's all right. They were focused on other things. And so on the grid, yes, absolutely. I think both of them have a longer window than just the next 2 years, really trying to figure out how do we shore up the demand side. We know that we're going to need more electricity resources in the state.
Yeah.
We know that they're not just going to be in the Golden Triangle between DFW, San Antonio, and Houston. That will need additional resources outside of that area. And so, how do we attract
especially
that
out in the
capital
Permian
investment?
Basin, right? I mean,
Permian Basin, but then also the Rio Grande Valley. We've had some phenomenal growth, and then into East Texas, where we continue to have expansion of the Haynesville, and we have lots of opportunities for manufacturing, being right there in kind of the Port of Houston area and corridor. There's some tremendous growth that can occur. And part of that system is outside of the ERCOT system, and so we need to be able to continue to attract investment across the state. And so we didn't see that really in the budget proposal as we were chatting before recording this morning. Didn't really see any items there to put money into that system or to attract additional investment. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what they put together, and that leads right into the Public Utility Commission voting yesterday for the performance credit mechanism, which unanimous vote. All 5 commissioners voted in favor of moving forward. I think if you were handicapping the vote, you would have said it would have been a 3-2 vote with Commissioner Gottfeldt and Commissioner Kobos being a little more critical of the proposal. But Chairman Lake took some recommendations from both commissioners to, if not reform it, at least add on some of their concerns, with the caveat that he still wants the legislature to weigh in on the proposal and the mechanism of the proposal. So it's not to be implemented today. It's got a runway to it, and we'll see kind of where the legislature weighs in. Senator Schwartner, who's the chairman of the Business and Commerce Committee in the Senate, sent a letter saying you haven't hit the mark. This is off from what I was intending in Senate Bill 3. You had some other folks express some critical concerns with it, but a little more support in the House, a little more support from the governor on this proposal. So we'll see as those committees start to get formed what the discussion is, what the dynamic is. I think we all know we're going to probably pay a little more for some added security and reliability, but where does that fall? Is it spread evenly? Those questions I think are yet to be answered by the legislature.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the PCM, just the general impression I have is it would spur some needed capacity additions of thermal dispatchable capacity that can fill in during these major weather events. But probably not enough of it, and I just really feel like the legislature is going to have to do something more than that, and because probably, I mean, folks I've talked to over the past couple of months, there seems to be a general consensus that we really need 10 to 12 gigawatts of additional thermal capacity in this state, and that PCM will probably spur the building of some, but not nearly that much. So got to account for growth. If you want to make the grid sustainable and reliable for 40 years, there's going to be a lot of growth in Texas economically and population wise, and in terms of demand on the grid. And yes, we need to continue to add renewables. There's no doubt about that, and that's going to happen. But, the limitations of renewables, particularly when the weather isn't right. And so we need that thermal capacity too. And it's up to the legislature to account for that. Anyway, that's my diatribe on that.
No, I think it's absolutely right, and 40 years is a pretty long runway because most of us, I think, when we're talking about these things, are really only go out to about 2050 when the population of Texas is supposed to double, and then if you're talking to the Biden administration, when we're supposed to be net zero, and so
right.
How do you build out a grid that accomplishes both those goals? Keeping in mind that we're going to continue to add larger users of electricity onto the grid. Anytime someone purchases an electric vehicle, that's 3 homes worth of air conditioning. So you're talking about a rapid growth of demand, and thankfully those vehicles are only about 4% of the fleet right now, but it is going to grow over the next couple decades. And so what is that going to look like?
Yeah, it's a lot to try to account for. So anyway, it's a mess that they're all going to have to deal with, and hopefully we'll do some good things. Hey, just a question about process there in Austin. I know, of course, in the last session, there were heavy restrictions related to COVID on access into the Capitol building and face-to-face lobbying and all that. Are there any lingering restrictions like that at the Capitol in this session?
No lingering restrictions as far as the entire bodies. Now, offices are still allowed to provide their own restrictions in place. And so walking through this past week, did see a few signs on some members' offices that they would request that a rapid test was done prior to entering the office. And DPS still does have that capability in the Capitol, but you're absolutely right. Last session, we had to go to a tent on the north side and basically sit there and wait. And so it was great actually catching most of the agency folks. That was the right spot to talk to them. So had lots of early mornings with Chairman Lake. Of course, he was at the Water Development Board at the time, but we sit there at the DPS station after we'd taken our nose swab and wait for our results to come back. So thankfully that has all gone away. And really what was remarkable these past couple of weeks at the Capitol was just the number of tourists that are there, and they're back, and then the legislature is in full session.
Well, good. That's great. It is such a beautiful building. Those tourist tours and big groups can be a bit of a nuisance at times, but you can't blame them for wanting to come in and see the building. It's really a neat place to be.
Absolutely.
So we're getting into the session. Let's talk about key committees here. Who's going to end up being the chairman of the energy committees and water committees and things like that? Who are the key folks you're going to be working with in this session?
Yeah, so the Senate is probably going to be the quicker organizing body. They really don't have as much movement and certainly don't have quite the preference card process that the House does. So on the Senate side, we're expecting Senator Birdwell to be back at Natural Resources and Economic Development. Really been a good champion for oil and gas and energy in particular. He's out of kind of the Hood County area, stretching down into Waco. We also have Senator Perry at Agriculture and Water, really been a champion on produced water research, and really I think is doing some smart things about trying to manage seismicity and seismic concerns in West Texas, really focusing on the higher ed aspect there and how we can kind of build out smarter regulation in that space. And so he's been a great champion there. On the House side, we mentioned him earlier, but Senator Schwertner at Business and Commerce, and Commerce really has a broad mission, but in particular, they've focused on electricity issues and the grid. And so they'll have ERCOT and PUC in there quite a bit. Managing those two agencies. On the House side, Speaker Phelan said that preference cards were due back to him this next week, Thursday, January 26th. And so really that's the start of the House's process. They get together and organize their committees, figure out how they're going to allocate. There's two different options in the rules. There's a preference for seniority on certain committees, and then there's the speaker's preference, and so it takes quite a while to build out. For example, if a representative asked to be on energy resources, which is the key committee for oil and gas regulation, then the speaker is able to fill 4 seniority spots in there, and so he'll kind of work down through and see who has the most seniority that asks for that committee, and then he'll be able to fill out the rest of the committee with his preferences, and usually has been the past practice, both a chairman from one party and a vice chairman from the other party has generally been the preference for speakers over the past several decades, and so I would anticipate that would be the same case. Energy resources is the key one for us in the House. We also follow state affairs and environmental regulation. And then we talked about natural resources last week. Tracy King, Democrat out of Uvalde, is currently there. We've got Craig Goldman as the chairman of energy resources out of the Fort Worth area. Brooks Landgraf out of Odessa is environmental regulation. These could all change.
Right.
I know you've got Craig up in your area, and Chairman Goldman has reminded me and reminded others when the session gavelled in, he was no longer the chair for the next session, and so we really wait and see what the speaker decides to do there. But we've had some great chairmen over the years. I'm partial to one of them, but just because I was working for him at the time. But Chairman Hardcastle, Chairman Lewis, Chairman Keffer, some really great folks that have been in that spot, and so we'll see kind of what we get this session.
Well, it's going to be interesting. It always is, and it's like like you said, it's a little harder to manage all that in the House where you got 150 members than it is in the Senate where you have 30. So it's not surprising it takes longer. So I know we're real early, but are there any key bills you're tracking right now, or are we just still a little too early in the process to have a good, strong list yet?
I think the budget's probably the key item. I'm up to about 46 bills. I've added a few this week, so maybe over 50. We work pretty closely with our partners at the Texas Oil and Gas Association, and they've got a bill track that's closer to 200 bills, but they're looking at the full value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream, and then some of the other kind of items, sunset, that sort of thing. So they've got a big list. I tend to focus more on upstream issues. I can't say that there's any bill that's just top of mind right now. As you know, some of those early bills, they're largely refiles from the previous session. And so unless you've got a member that's just been working hard over the interim to smooth out some of the issues, maybe make corrections, that bill might have the same fate that the earlier one did, and so simply filing it earlier doesn't really help it along in the process. And so, well, I would anticipate nearly 7,000 bills filed again this year. They're up to nearly 2,000 bills filed so far, and their deadline for filing those bills is kind of the first week of March, and so we'll have a flood over the next 45 days or so until they can get them all in.
So just to give folks an idea, so in a session where you have 7,000 bills get filed, last session, how many bills actually got passed? Do you know that number?
It was just over 1,000.
Over 1,000, so about 1 out of 7. Yeah,
1 out of 7.
Yeah, and so the hard part is really just figuring out, well, which one of these bills is actually going to go somewhere, right? So
that's
you
right.
don't spend
that's
time
right.
on bills that have no chance to go.
Absolutely. Our Constitution requires the legislature to really segment their time into thirds. So the first third is the introduction of bills. The second third is committee meetings, and then the third is passage on the floor. And so there's lots of complaints about that. Well, you know, you're in 140 days. Why don't you get to work on the very first day? But I think our founders kind of hit it right, that folks need to go back home. They need to get organized. And frankly, the public needs time to read through some of these
Right.
bills. In other states, it's a 30 to 60 day sprint. They meet every year. And that's not our preference. That's not our desire to do that here in Texas.
Yeah, I had to work in some of those states. It was barely organized chaos when you had those 30 or 60-day sessions. This is a lot better, folks. You got to have some structure around this stuff, or it just becomes impossible to keep up with. And you end up with too many unpleasant surprises for the public when you do it that way. At least
That's
that's
right.
Last thing, what about any regulatory actions? Anything going on at the Railroad Commission or TCEQ?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Railroad Commissioner Jim Wright, when he was elected in 2020, but 2021 came into office, really had a focus on Rule 8. Rule 8 is how oil and gas operators manage their waste. It's a critical area for lots of different service companies, but also for operators. And while it's had some significant improvements in the way that staff process things, how they enforce the rules, we really haven't had a major rule revision since the 90s. And so Commissioner Wright really coming on board, and his background in the waste business said, I want to tackle this. I want to modernize this and really make it more understandable from a lay person, but then also on the enforcement side, clear direction to the regulated community. This is what we're expecting. And so he launched a task force shortly after he was elected to work on recommendations there. You also had several legislators really pass some new rules, new guidance to the commission. Senator Perry, as I mentioned, Robert Nichols out of East Texas, and then my former boss, Representative Darby, also passed a provision really asking the Railroad Commission to modernize the rules to match some of the requirements that operators have, as well as commercial operators have. So commercial being that they take waste from multiple different leases and sources, and really try to harmonize that. Staff has done a phenomenal job at the Railroad Commission, kind of collecting all of our initial inputs. That's now with Commissioner Wright. Commissioner Wright's working on kind of putting his stamp of approval, and then to go sell it to the other commissioners at an open meeting to say, I really think that this is a good step forward in modernizing this rule. We're anticipating that to start taking place over February and March. So it'll add a new wrinkle. Typically, agencies don't do rulemaking during a legislative session, but there's such an emphasis both from the legislature and from Commissioner Wright to work on this. And so we'll probably be doing some double duty, being at the legislature and then going over the Railroad Commission and kind of working on these issues at the same time.
Man.
But it'll be a positive step. Really, all of the trades have pulled together to work on these issues, try to get lots of input from our members, and really the industry has modernized pretty considerably, as you can imagine, over the past 2 decades. And the technology and the practices are quite a bit more advanced than they were when the rule was first put into place. And so liners, spill prevention, some of the other kind of new techniques to make sure that waste can be converted into beneficial uses, whether it's for road base or other types of items. So they've got their work cut out for them, kind of managing both the legislative session and a rulemaking at the same time. But I think Commissioner Wright's pushing hard to make that happen.
He's a great guy. I wrote a magazine piece about him in Shell Magazine when he first came in, and he's from my part of Texas, so I really like him a lot. I think this discussion tells me I need to get him on my actual podcast, my Energy Question podcast. I'll have to give him a call.
You absolutely do.
Anything else before we go?
I think that's about it. I'm surprised you weren't in Davos this week.
I gotta admit, I spent a lot of time online and on TV watching all the interviews out of there. My gosh, some crazy stuff coming out of there.
I was happy they finally invited some oil and gas CEOs back to the event,
Yeah.
and then there were some great interviews. I saw you were plugging Daniel Yergin this morning, but
Yeah.
Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema had a really good panel, and then you always just hear just the crazy announcements from former Vice President Al Gore and Secretary Kerry, and
Oh
so
my gosh.
it's quite a sideshow for a week, but.
That
Appreciate you
rant
covering it.
that rant by Al Gore was just man, it was deranged. It's really wild. Anyway, let's wrap it up. That's all for this week, folks. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you for joining us.